Oh. Guys, you guys distract each other too much. Okay, today's an exciting day because we get to talk about the birds and the bees.
Oh, yeah.
Reproduction. Plant reproduction, sorry. All right, in fact, got an example over here. Our first type of plant reproduction. This is my spider plant here. Got a little scraped up. This is a rough one. That's good. Because it's decided to send out this big old like stem shoot thing over here. And then what's it growing at the end? What's this? More plant, yeah. It grows a big old tendril way up here to this other plant. If I were to break this off, what would happen? Big boy. Okay, what this is, it's doing vegetative reproduction. It's growing this big old tendril, and then it's growing a whole other plant right here. In fact, if this was down by the soil, this would start growing a bunch of roots, and then it would eventually, this tendril might wither and die once this guy starts making his own energy and getting enough nutrients and stuff. So that's what it tries to do. It's growing a whole nother organism. It's called vegetative reproduction. There's an example here in Fairbanks. One of the species we have are aspen trees. And the cool thing about aspen trees is they can send out these tendrils underground, which then spring up into new aspen trees. And so you can have whole like sections of forest where all these aspen trees are all just the exact same organism, really. Good question. That goes back to that video we saw about like the definition of tree, right? Would you consider them the same tree or different trees? They're genetically identical. They're actually connected cellularly. Yeah.
What did you call the stuff that grows under that connects them?
They're called rhizomes, but you don't have to know that. These are aspen trees. But they basically grow a stem section underground that then can grow up into its own little organism. They obviously have their own like root systems. But these guys are all connected. Are they separate organisms? Well, no, maybe, kind of, a little. If I were to come through and like dig a big trench and like cut off this last tree from all the rest of them, would this tree live just fine? Yeah, because it has its own roots and stuff. So I could, in theory, like cut it off from its neighbors. It would be genetically identical. Aspen trees can also reproduce like sexually and grow seeds and all that, but this is one of the ways they can colonize the hillside. You'll see this in the fall. When you look up at the hills around Fairbanks, a lot of the like deciduous forests are aspens. Chloe, you're not on your phone, are you? Yeah, just put it away, please. Okay, a lot of the hillsides will be these aspens, and you can look up there, and as they start to change color, birch forests will change like one tree at a time, like one tree here, one tree here, one tree here. Aspen trees will change one like tree at a time because they're all genetically identical. They're all chemically linked to each other through their cells. You'll have this big swath of forest where there'll be like 5 acres that all turn yellow at once. And then another 5 acres over here will turn yellow at once. And that's because they're just these aspen organisms. Yeah.
Does that mean that they photosynthesize the same thing?
Yeah, they do all the same photosynthesis. They can share nutrients with each other, all that stuff, yeah.
Okay, so if they're all changing together, they're all growing together, they're all connected to each other, they're all getting the same food.
Yeah.
But they're still not technically considered the same tree, or they can.
They're the same organism for sure, but like maybe with multiple trees. One organism, multiple trees. Like it's kind of a weird deal. Anyway, aspen trees are kind of cool. Let's talk about gymnosperms. So remember, gymno means naked. Yeah. So these are naked seeds. These are the cone the cone plants. So we're going to go through kind of how these guys reproduce. We'll start with the seed. They often have like a little whirligig that helps them fly through the air. It's going to go ahead and germinate. And then it grows up into a big old spruce tree.
What is the first thing?
Like a seed. Okay, this spruce tree is a sporophyte. Remember, they're going to do alternation of generations. This is the diploid section. And some species, there's male trees and female trees. I think, though I'm not 100% sure, I'll have to check it. I think that the white spruce and black spruce are both like hermaphroditic, where they're both sexes. But regardless, they have separate cones, the male and female cones. So you guys are probably most familiar with the female cones. They look something like this. They're the larger cones that hang out on the bottom of branches. And then the male cones are a lot smaller. Yeah. They're at like the tips of branches. They usually look like this. Boop, boop, like that. These are the male cones. These are the female ones. Okay, and inside the male ones, they release spores.
Are the female ones the male ones just like the pine needles?
They're not the needles themselves, they're at the tips here of the branches. You'll see these little tiny guys.
But what actually are they?
They're male cones.
What does that mean?
It's sporophyte tissue that makes spores. So the little tiny spores, they start off as little tiny spores, but then they grow up into adult sporophytes. Kind of like this. This is pollen. And in fact, inside every pollen grain is at least 2, sometimes more, sperm. So the pollen is the adult gametophyte generation. So we have the sporophyte over here. These are gametophytes, or the haploid generation. Females, same sort of deal, except it's inside the cone structure. So if I draw the cone, look at it kind of like this, and then there's this like cavity. And it starts off as just a single spore, but then it quickly grows into this big, well, not super big, but this much larger like ovule. That's ovule, O-V-U-L-E. And then the gametophyte, the female gametophyte here, it grows an egg inside.
Wait, but why would they be only, and they came from the sporophyte? Are they technically spores?
They started as a single spore, a single cell, and then they've grown into this multicellular structure.
Well, like with so like if you start back with a sporophyte, like a spruce tree, and then they have the pine needles or the tips of the needles.
They're called sporophytes because they make spores.
But then why are they only N?
They're 2N. The sporophytes are 2N.
Yeah.
And then they're going to make a haploid spore. The spore itself just grows into the gametophyte.
Oh, okay, and it is placed on like the tip of the pine needle.
Yeah, in fact, yeah, this is pollen grains. These are absolutely tiny. They're hard to see, but they'll make, you know, millions of little tiny pollen grains. The female parts are not millions, but maybe, I don't know, what's on a spruce cone? Maybe like 60, 40, something like that. Individual seeds will grow out of one. So, yeah. In spruce trees, how does the pollen get to the ovule? Does anyone know?
Air.
Yeah, air, just by the wind. They're wind dispersed. So the wind comes along, it blows the pollen, so it has access to the egg. This is what happens inside. We'll draw it a little bit bigger. This is inside the female cone. You have the haploid gametophyte. You have the pollen lands on it. And somehow, the sperm that are inside the pollen need to make their way to the egg. Well, how do they do that? They actually, the male part grows a tube that connects to the egg. So it grows a tube over to the egg, and then the sperm inside the pollen are able to swim up the tube, fertilize the egg. Once the egg is fertilized, then you can have a growing embryo. The rest of the gametophyte is kind of irrelevant and falls away or dies, and this develops into the seed.
It's in the ovule egg.
Sorry, what was the question?
What's in the ovule egg?
In the ovule, yeah, so the ovule is the entire female gametophyte generation. It's just cellular tissue, and then within that, there's at least one egg.
Oh, okay.
And the egg, remember, that's the reproductive one that needs to be fertilized to go on to make the
And then
sporophyte stage.
the ovule is just like the whole outside of the tissue.
Yeah, the whole ovule is the whole thing. The egg is just the part that the cell that gets fertilized.
And the wind is how the pollen gets
Yep.
to the egg.
And then we've seen this anytime, like in the, I'm just trying to remember when these guys release it. It's usually in the spring or summer, early summer, where all the spruce trees are releasing their pollen. You'll go outside, there'll be pollen on the cars, pollen in the puddles, things like that. Galen, you can put your phone in your locker, please. All right, let's talk about flowers. Angiosperms. Okay, this one is more of an anatomy thing. I'm just gonna throw a bunch of terms at you. My apologies that there's so many terms, but I just wanna make sure we're all on the same page and have them. So we're gonna start with these little green guys that are kind of right down by the base of the flower. And then we'll draw the petals. I'm not gonna draw the rest of the petals. They're like kind of in the middle. We'll do cross section. But these little tiny green leaf-like things are called sepals. You all know what petals are. Okay, and then the female part. Looks kind of like that. The female section is called a pistil. P-I-S-T-I-L. The male part, there's usually multiple, at least two, but they look kind of like that. The male part is called a stamen. And you can remember that because the word stamen has the word men in it, which is how you remember it's the male part. And my wife owns more pistils than I do, so that's how I remember pistil. Okay, and then there's a few more like subparts here. For the male, there's that anther and filament. And for the female, there's the stigma. This is called the style. And then down at the bottom, this is the ovary. So I know there's a bajillion terms.
Too fast, sir.
Anther and filament. You can remember a filament because it's just a really thin, this is the thinnest one of the parts. It's a really thin filament, so they just call it filament.
What is the style?
The style is the shaft here,
Out of the whole thing?
the shaft of the pistil. Yeah. So the top of the pistil is the stigma. That's where the pollen's going to land. The style is this big, long, skinny section. And then the ovary is down at the bottom. That's where the eggs are. And again, sometimes, question? Yep. Sometimes you'll have male and female flowers, and sometimes they'll be on different plants. Sometimes they'll be on the same plant, but it's not an issue. A lot of times, though, you'll have a flower like this, where it's basically hermaphroditic flowers, where the female part is right next to the male part. What's the downside of that? Yes, inbreeding. It's called self-fertilization. You think it's bad having a kid with a parent or a sibling? Well, self-fertilizing is twice as bad as that, genetically, right?
Isn't that just like those weird asexual organism things? Like,
Um,
the same thing.
This is different than cloning yourself. This is where you're making sperm, making eggs, and then combining them. And you lose half of your genetic information that way. It's quite bad genetically. But the whole reason why inbreeding isn't good is because you have these any deleterious recessive alleles will become really common. It could be really bad for the organism. Anyway, there are some ways they can avoid it. Any ideas?
Removing one.
Removing one half? Yeah, in fact, we could physically separate them. So if they're separate, if there's some kind of barrier between the stigma and the anther, that helps quite a bit. You can temporally separate them, where maybe the anther isn't releasing pollen until after the stigma has been fertilized, or vice versa. And that way you are guaranteed only getting pollen from a different flower. You can also, there's some ways to chemically make it difficult.
You can see.
Chemically
Timing, what do you mean by
timing. Whereas if you start releasing pollen before your stigma is ready to accept any pollen, right? Then your pollen won't fertilize your stigma, or vice versa. Your stigma is ready to accept pollen, but you don't release any pollen. And then after it's fertilized, then you release your pollen. So that way you don't fertilize yourself, but you're fertilizing other flowers. Another thing you can do is just not worry about it and just be okay with self-fertilization. And some plants do this, especially plants that make lots and lots of seeds. If you make, 100,000 seeds and half of them are self-fertilized and have really poor genetics, how many seeds have good genetics and aren't self-fertilized? That gives you 50,000 that are, right? So sometimes some species are just you know what, I'm just gonna make a bajillion seeds, I'm not gonna worry about it. Some of them might have horrible genes, but that's okay.
what even defines terrible genes for why do they care?
Like genes that don't help them grow very quickly, that sort of thing. So they end up dying, but they're made a bunch of offspring, so they don't care. All right, let's talk about Flowering plants and kind of how they reproduce real quick. So inside the ovary is a similar sort of structure. This is part of the sporophyte tissue. And the sporophyte makes a single spore. Boom, right there. The spore is going to undergo mitosis only 3 times. That's its entire life cycle. Is just, oh, I'm going to do mitosis 3 times. At the end of mitosis, those 3 mitosis things, then I'm going to create the eggs, and they're going to get fertilized, and my generation is over. So this is the gametophyte. So it does mitosis 3x. After it does mitosis, it starts with a single nucleus. After it does mitosis once, how many nuclei does it have? 2. 1, 2. Okay, it does mitosis again. It has 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And sometimes it separates them into separate cells. But in this case, at the end, we're going to have how many nuclei? 8. 1, 2, 3. 3 of them become eggs that almost never get fertilized. 3 of them become eggs which could become fertilized. And then the remaining 2 become what are called polar bodies. Polar bodies also occur in humans. Humans, we do meiosis twice, and we end up with 3 polar bodies. They don't do anything in humans. In the case of a plant, these later become the fruit. So like if you're eating a peach or something, that peach, the flesh of the peach, was the polar body of the gametophyte.
Is the polar body just an egg that never...
Kind of, yeah. It's part of the gametophyte generation.
And is it a nucleus then, or is it just...
These are the nuclei here, these little dots. So sometimes the polar bodies are separate cells, sometimes they're one big cell. These are the eggs.
And the 2 dots in the middle are the polar bodies, correct?
Yeah, yep. Cool, so there's 8 total.
8 total nuclei.
8 total nuclei, yeah. 2 polar bodies, 3 eggs.
6 eggs, right?
Yeah, these ones hardly count.
Wow.
Because they don't get fertilized. Okay, let's draw the... I don't know if they're technically considered eggs or not. So here in the bottom of the ovary, something like this. So this is the gametophyte, the female gametophyte growing down there. Here's our eggs. Up at the top, this is the stigma. You'll have the pollen grain will land. And then the pollen grain, again, this is a whole like little organism of gametophyte tissue. It has to get its sperm down here to the eggs. So what does it do? It grows a tube.
Are those eggs in the bottom and top?
These are eggs down here. And so it grows a pollen tube. Or the sperm. Same sort of deal. Here's a little sperm. There we go. So then the sperm are able to make their way down. Then they can fertilize the egg. But note that this pollen tube is grown from the pollen. Okay, we're gonna pause there in the notes. We're gonna watch a video. Unfortunately, it's not one that plays on my smart TV. So, we're gonna use my projector. Aiden, can you hop up, push the power button on my projector up there?
Which one, Kat?
I've been like stabbed by
All right, put away your notes. You don't have to take notes on this. Yeah. I'm not going to require you like pay super close attention. It is a kids show, so it's designed for like lower level things. But the artwork is really good, and they show like a lot of this anatomy sort of things. So do pay attention to that as we go through.